The Penguin on HBO Max, based on the Penguin from the Batman movie, is easily a top 5 show of 2024. I'd personally have it at number 3 right now, behind Shogun and The Gentleman. Obviously, I was hoping Arcane Season 2 would be up there. It's nowhere close. The Penguin is really well written. It's got great performances from the entire cast, but Colin Farrell and Kristen Milioti in particular are awesome. Even random characters that only have a couple minutes of screen time, like Magpie, put in really solid showings. Victor does a great job as kind of a parallel to a younger Oz and functioning as his right-hand man. Mark Strong and Clancy Brown are always great, and I thought they were pretty solid choices for Carmine Falcone and Sal Maroni. The show deserves awards for whoever did Penguin's makeup. Even knowing it was Colin Farrell, you still can't tell it's him, but at the same time, he manages to get a ton of expression through the makeup and fat suit.
What did you lose by keeping him alive?
Don't you fucking touch her! Don't fucking touch her!
Kristen Milioti is great as Sophia at being both clever and ruthless, but in control, while still managing to seem like she's unhinged and a bit feral and could just snap at any moment.
Stronger.
I believe the last time we were all together was my father's birthday, 10 years ago. I'm sure you all remember that night. I know I do.
For this video, I'm going to give a quick plot synopsis, but mainly what I want to talk about is what I liked, issues that I think the show has from an objective standpoint, and then some subjective issues with the show that I have. And the subjective issues that I have are the reason that I won't be rewatching it. So let's get into it. The gist of the plot is that Oz wants to rise to power and is trying to pit the Falcones versus the Maronis to make them wipe each other out so that there'll be a power vacuum and he'll be the last one standing to fill that void. He wants to fill this void by combining all the smaller gangs that have been held down by the Falcones and Maronis who run shit. On a personal level, he has to deal with the pressure from his mother, Frances, as well. She thinks she deserves a better lifestyle, and he keeps promising one but not delivering. Sophia Falcone was a normal girl who was framed by her father for the women that he killed, and she got stuck in Arkham for a decade. Her primary goal was revenge for her brother and against Oz, who she blames for betraying her to her father, along with revenge against her family who helped put her in Arkham to begin with. Victor tries to steal rims off Oz's car, and Oz decides to use him as his right-hand man, and they slowly develop a bond and trust each other as Victor becomes a more hardened criminal over the course of the season. As part of Sophia's quest for revenge for her brother, she develops a mushroom-based drug called Bliss, and there's a three-way feud between the Falcones, Maronis, and Oz, where they whittle each other down throughout the season, culminating in the death of the Maronis and the Falcones. Sophia ends up back in Arkham. Oz finally reaches the penthouse with his mom like he always wanted, even though she's a vegetable. And that's where the season ends. We see the bat signal, Penguin's in charge of the underworld, Sophia is getting reached out to by Selena Kyle, and the Falcones and Maronis, for all intents and purposes, are gone. And these are just the broad strokes of the plot. I covered it in a lot more detail in my episode-by-episode videos, or you should just go watch the show. It's worth watching, and even my take about not wanting to rewatch it has me in the minority. I'm going to start off with the things I liked about the show. One thing the show does really well is the characters are really well established almost immediately after being on screen, so you know exactly who you're dealing with. One example of this is the very first episode of the season is we see who Oz is immediately, and it's done in a really clever way. He's talking to Alberto Falcone, the new head of the Falcone crime family, talking about a guy that he looked up to as a kid, and he's describing what he wants to become himself. And after this really long monologue, Alberto makes fun of him and humiliates him, so he shoots him. Right away, we know what his long-term goals are, what he wants to become. We see that he's impulsive when he's angry, and we find out that humiliation is a big trigger for him, and it's something that we see all season, and really a core personality trait of his. And this is the event that sparks off the conflict of the entire season. Obviously, a much simpler and much less subtle version of this would be something like One Piece, which I enjoyed, but they literally just had the main character scream his goal and motivation to start the show.
Follow my dream to find the One Piece and become King of the Pirates!
Of course, there being a clear goal at all is better than most of what we get right now. Looking at you, Acolyte. I just used Oz as an example since he's the main character, but this is done really well for all the characters in the show. Another thing that I like is the show has a ton of great little character moments, and the dynamics between the characters all feel unique because they feel like real people, so they deal with each other in different ways. You don't just treat everyone the same. I like the dynamic between Oz and Victor in particular. One of my favorite little scenes in the show is between Oz and Victor. Victor is stuttering trying to order at a fancy restaurant, and the waiter finishes the order for him, and Oz cuts him off and says, "Don't do that," and makes Victor do the whole order. And then he explains to him that people need to operate on his time. Like, you're in charge, you're in control. And he's also sticking up for him about his condition, because Oz obviously has conditions of his own. Obviously, a stutter isn't as severe as a limp in the hand that Oz has to deal with, but the parallels are very obvious, and you can see how Oz gets defensive on his behalf at anything that he interprets as embarrassing or humiliating, because that's his trigger that he's projecting onto Victor. I really like the interactions between Oz and his mother, where whenever he's struggling, she insults him and tells him to man up and really harangues him on a focus of how he needs to be a man and have pride. Their relationship is a really good example of the problems with honor culture and how quickly it devolves into violence, where most white-collar people probably don't even understand it because they operate in dignity cultures. For people who don't know about honor culture versus dignity culture, honor culture is really about reputation and social status as other people see you. So being disrespected is a huge deal, and you have to respond to maintain your status. And this response is often in the form of violence. Dignity culture is more about placing value on yourself. And if you have issues with people, you seek to solve them within the confines of what's socially acceptable, within the confines of the law. And violence is very frowned upon and kind of viewed as barbaric. I think the portrayal of the honor culture mentality throughout the show is great. All of the characters do it to some degree, but it's really exemplified in the relationship between Oz and his mother, Frances. On the other side, the interactions between Sophia and her family are great too. Throughout the season, as she's losing control, her hair gets messier and crazier looking. It's just a nice little detail. But one of the things I really love about her character is that throughout the season, people are constantly watching her from the periphery of the screen. Even when she's just walking around or eating, everyone has an eye on her. There's a really nice scene between her and her cousin, where her cousin pulls the daughter closer to her as they're talking after she was faking being nice to her. Everyone is just uncomfortable around her all the time, and she really leans into it. And it's more fucked up when you know that she didn't actually do those things, but now she's crazy anyway. Even the way that she eats is kind of savage and gross. None of these things are a super big deal on their own, but I love just having that constant pressure on her and the constant eyes on her. And it's a really good way to show what people think of her as the hangman and how on edge they are just being around her. And how much for her, there's just never a break and she's always on edge and she's always being watched. It's just a subtle, relentless pressure that feels like it's constantly grinding her down and just slowly driving her crazy. And another thing that the show does really well is revealing new information, oftentimes through flashbacks to give us more context as to why the characters are the way that they are. For example, we don't get Victor's backstory for a couple episodes to figure out why this seemingly good kid was trying to steal and is willing to commit these crimes for Oz. And in this flashback, we see where the Riddler's terrorist attack from the movie The Batman flooded his apartment complex and killed his family. And the dynamic between him and his family is really interesting because you see that he was the one who was ambitious and wanted more, while his family was just appreciative for what they already had. And it really puts his worldview into perspective of why he's willing to become a criminal for money and status, and why he keeps taking that next step forward to really ingratiate himself in the underworld. This is actually also one of my disappointments with the way that his season ended. I was really hoping that his ambition would evolve into greed to the point where Penguin would have to put him down. That's obviously not the way the show goes. This is also something they do well with Sophia, where we keep seeing her be crazy and she's called the hangman, but we don't know the full context. We get her flashback episode in episode 4, where they reveal that her father framed her. She was a relatively normal girl when she was younger. And we get her entire de-evolution through this slow, deliberate, methodical breakdown of her psyche. And that's what drives her crazy and turns her into what we see now. It's funny because I've ripped The Acolyte for useless flashback episodes. They don't justify any of the present actions. Recently, I ripped Doom Prophecy for being really boring and wasting an episode on a flashback, where we really don't get any new character work, we don't get any new information that's interesting, and it just feels like a filler. This show uses flashbacks really effectively throughout the season, and it should serve as an example for other shows on how to use them. These flashbacks are done throughout the season, and every single one reveals really important information, really important character moments, really important motivating factors as to why they are the way they are now. And we see it for essentially the entire cast. The last thing that I want to praise the show for is that it has the balls to pay off the setups that it starts. Looking at you, Arcane Season 2, for completely backing out of Jinx's whole fucking villain arc and Caitlyn's authoritarian dictator arc. The Penguin throughout the season shows Victor's behavior escalate for what he's willing to do to the point where he runs over Maroni henchmen, executes Squid to protect Oz, and is willing to stand up to the small gang leaders when they try to bail on Oz. Oz sets up the Maronis, and he's willing to burn Sal's wife and son alive. We see his personality traits in the first scene, and the flashbacks in the last 2 episodes reveal that he's even willing to kill his own brothers for humiliating him. He keeps his mother alive as a vegetable when she said not to. A lot of shows won't commit to making their villain a complete villain, and this show goes all the way with it. So I really do think it deserves praise in that regard. Now I want to get into a few things that I think are just objectively issues for the show. The biggest one to me is plot armor. We see this mainly with Oz, but we do see it a few times throughout the season, and it serves to keep him alive, so it's kind of a big deal the way that it's used. One example that we see is when he goes to meet Nadia Maroney, he goes with one henchman, and he's able to take out like 8 guys in an ambush when they're completely surrounded. The finale episode is probably the most egregious, where he's duct taped to a chair with guns pointed at him, and he's able to break out of the chair, shoot all of them, and carry his mom out after he's been stabbed. I just picked the 2 most obvious ones, but I'm sure you get the point. I'm sure there's other examples throughout the season if you want to be really nitpicky. There's also just the general dynamic of everyone wants to kill him, but he weasels out of it over and over. And this is kind of subjective, but at some point, it does feel like someone would just shoot him and be done with it. Sophia has him strapped naked to a chair in episode 1. She has him again strapped to a chair in episode 8, and both times he gets out of it. He's held at gunpoint by the Maronis at the end of an episode and gets out of it because of Victor. He's ambushed by Sal and gets out of it. So just when it happens over and over, there's a threshold for everybody that's going to be different, where it just feels like it's too much and it just kind of feels lucky or plot armory. Another issue is I'm just not sure that I buy the mafia would follow Sophia. She kidnaps and tortures Vidi because he has to get the men together for her, and then he still does it anyway instead of just offing her and running the family himself. This eventually gets him shot in the head with no resistance, and I'm just not sure how long she could have lasted or who would have lasted in that environment, not only as a woman, but as an insane person who spent 10 years in Arkham. I just don't know if I buy that everyone would just step in line for her. Like, yeah, she gives him a big bag of money, but there should have been a power struggle before that as soon as the family was wiped out. And also, they're just willing to follow someone who everyone views as insane, fairly or not. And then she talks throughout the show about how misogynistic the mafia is and that no woman has ever led and they would never follow a woman. So I just feel like that dynamic kind of stretches the limits of what should be happening in this world. The last thing that I want to talk about are my issues with the show that are pretty much just personal preference. One of these is the character of Dr. Rush, who I've been calling Sal Volcano for the entire season. He's just really an annoying simp, and the only purpose that he seems to have is the final episode with manipulating Francis, and it kind of seems like they didn't know what to do with him beyond that. So they just have him there to kiss Sophia's ass the whole time. He's by far the least interesting character to me, and also kind of the least dynamic and fleshed out. Not a fan at all of that character. Nothing against the actor. He was working with what they gave him, but I just fucking did not like him. My other subjective issue, and this is the much bigger one, is the last 2 episodes are what took away any rewatch value for me. And I'll go ahead and preface this because based on the comments I got, people think I didn't understand the show, or I'm just too dumb to get it, or I was unaware that the Penguin was a Batman villain. And I've already praised what they did with it. And neutrally speaking, the last 2 episodes are very well executed. And they committed to making him a pure villain. And they made for a good twist on your first watch through. But what they also did for me was make me not want to watch it again, because it makes the show kind of a miserable experience with no one to root for. Like, knowing who's going to live and die and that there's no morality in play, everyone's just a psychopath, just doesn't make me want to watch it again. Something that I thought was really interesting throughout the season. So in the last 2 episodes, we see that Oz is a complete psychopath. He murdered his brothers as a child. He murders Victor, who's been loyal to him and saved him repeatedly. He's willing to sacrifice his mother and let her get tortured right in front of him to keep her alive as a vegetable, purely to justify his own self-satisfaction because he wants her to be proud of him. And then he's also revealed to have this kind of Oedipus complex. And though I praised it for having the balls to commit, I think the reason I just didn't enjoy it, obviously he's the bad guy from literally the first scene of the show. But these last 2 episodes confirm that he's just a complete psychopath and there is no gray area. He throws his men under the bus throughout the season. He sacrifices people when he needs to. One of the best parts is when he has that kind of heart-to-heart conversation with Sophia, and then immediately says, fuck Sophia, and is willing to let her die. One of the things I liked about the show is it made him someone you could root for during this show, who would also clearly be a villain in the next Batman movie, by surrounding him with people who are far worse than him. And while he's pretty ruthless and calculating, he also seemed to have a soft spot for his mother and Eve and Victor. And I like the balance of having a bad guy be your protagonist who's just a little bit less bad than everyone else, so you can root for him. And he does seem to have kind of a soft spot and a moral streak for the people he's close to. I thought that made him really interesting and a kind of realistic, dynamic character. And the last 2 episodes turning him into 100% evil, to me, makes him less interesting, and it makes the idea of rewatch seem kind of torturous because I'll just hate every person in the show. And people have already shit on me, and I know they're going to keep shitting on me for this take. I don't care. But I'd be curious if this show was just called Colin in the Fat Suit and it wasn't tied to Batman and this overarching thing, if they would consider this a step down as far as making your villain interesting. Because to me, you've almost made him one-dimensional by making him so evil with no redeeming qualities and no one that he cares about and isn't willing to sacrifice. And the Oedipus complex, it's been a thing I feel like a lot in recent media, and it just seemed unnecessary and over the top to me when he's already clearly a piece of shit. He's already unlikable. You've made him a psychopath, and now you add this whole incestuous thing about his mom. It's just fucking weird. A show with a similar dynamic to this show is Breaking Bad, where we watch Walter White become more evil as the show goes on. And I think for everybody, there's a different point where you start hoping that Walter dies. Something that show had going for it that this one doesn't is that because the cast was larger, there were characters who still seemed right and moral and who you could root for. And Walter was also fighting against the cartel. So it's very easy to justify like, well, fuck him then. Who cares? Until you start seeing the fucked up stuff that he does on his power trip to inflate his own ego and because he gets carried away. If this show had been in chronological order, I wonder if the story would have suffered for that, because then you don't get the reveals and the twist, and then you know right from the jump that he's just an absolute psycho. So watching this again is just unappealing to me. And when I was comparing it to Breaking Bad, because Walter's surrounded by good people, if you rewatch this show, there are no good people. Even the small gangs that he gets to join up and recruit and follow him, literally every single number 2 in those gangs betrays their boss. Not a single person had loyalty. To me, that's just crazy and a really pessimistic message that just anyone can be bought. Everyone's a piece of shit to that degree that they're willing to betray people and kill them. And just all of that combined really makes the idea of a rewatch unappealing to me. And like I said, it was solid. It was well executed. I just don't think I would enjoy it if I watched it again, knowing everything else now. Even though he was obviously bad, you can always root for a bad guy who's less bad than other shitty people. But now we know he's the worst one. So if you watch this, there's no one to root for. You just kind of hope that everyone fucking dies. Or you wish that Batman would show up and kick their asses. So these are the main things that I wanted to talk about. One of the best shows of the year, for sure. And I would absolutely recommend people watching it, despite my negative feelings toward the ending. Because I know I'm in the minority with my opinion. I don't particularly care. And I understand why it went the way that it did and it was set up and paid off. Doesn't mean I have to like it just because it was well executed. So I'm going to leave it here for this one. If you've seen the show, let me know what you think. I try to respond to all the comments that aren't just insults. Like and subscribe and all that shit. Thanks. See ya.